figured it'd be fitting to talk about beer and also just kind of what's happening with kind of on the food side of some of what was actually just talked about with fashion. So super excited to be here. And actually, fun fact, so the water stat is a really interesting one with beer. There's actually even more water that's used. About 90% of the water from beer production is actually in the agricultural supply chain and the growing of the grain itself. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about my business, but first to frame this a bit, and I have a PDF, so I might just need to, oh, that worked, great. So what I'm here to talk about is circular economy. You guys know all about this, right? This is bad, this is the linear economy. This is recycling, this is good, okay? So, you know, with the circular economy, with something like fashion, you look at a company like Patagonia, they're taking, you know, they do lots of things, but they take plastic bottles, they turn them into down jackets, lots of great stuff. It doesn't really get talked about as much with food. With food, you know, you guys, I know there's several food waste presentations this morning. You probably heard the stat that 40% of all edible food is wasted, right? That's, I mean, we can all agree that's too much. It's wasted calories, it's wasted resources. It's also a really big opportunity. But when we think about closing the loop with food, often we think about compost, right? Food recycling, which is great for coffee grounds, eggshells, scraps. But for some of the very edible looking food, there's, you know, potentially a lot more that can be done with it. With us, we've actually identified a underutilized resource that could be in the food system that isn't currently, that isn't even included in those statistics. And that, as my shirt suggests, is it comes from beer. It's the grain from the beer producing process. And what ReGrained exists to do is close the loop between the brewing industry and the food system. And we're here to kind of reimagine, you know, what if the end of a supply chain was the beginning of a food revolution. And we're part of a growing movement that I just wanted to talk a bit more about. But first to tell you kind of how we got into edible upcycling, or, you know, when I feel extra nerdy, I call it food waste alchemy, which I consumer tested and no one knew what I was talking about. So we tried to distill it pretty simply in this graphic here. To make beer, there's 4 simple ingredients. You use grain, you use water, you use hops, you use yeast. Only the sugars from the grain are required to make the beer itself. So the byproduct from the beer brewing process is considered spent grain by the industry. Some of you guys who are haulers in the room are probably familiar with seeing this stuff if you, you know, are a municipal hauler. Traditionally, all this has gone to agricultural use. Still about 80% of it in the country does get fed to cattle, pigs, things like that. But in cities, with the boom in craft beer, everything's changing. More and more 2 new breweries are opening a day. A lot of them are opening up in cities. And there's a lot of this grain, and there's a lot of really good stuff left behind. And so we propose a higher use of it, an upcycle. In the US, we're brewing 6.3 billion gallons of beer, just to put that into context a little bit. It's about a pound of grain for every 6-pack of beer that's produced. You know, stronger beers like your IPAs will use more grain than you know, something like a light Kolsch. But the amount of grain, you know, used and that, you know, 6.3 billion gallons of beer that we drink every year, about a pound of grain for every 6-pack. I mean, if you were to process that into an ingredient, it'd be enough for 34 loaves of bread for every American, or put it in some sweeter terms for you, it's 1,362 cookies each. I mean, there's just massive amounts of this grain, and currently it's not being used in its, you know, highest possible use, and that's what we exist to change. So how did we come up with this? We were 2 home brewers. I learned how to brew beer when I was 19 because I liked to drink and I couldn't buy beer, and I thought that would be a fun way to kind of get creative about that. And discovered through that process, actually, I grew up in Northern California. I was at UCLA. We didn't even have a composting system. If I went to Berkeley, I probably would have never come up with the idea because I'd been like, oh, coffee grounds, just like, you know, other spent things that goes in the compost. But I was literally dumping what felt like a vat of oatmeal into the dumpster. And so kind of that contrast of what shouldn't be waste that was waste, you know, was really stark. And so we decided to launch. First I was making bread and selling that to friends so I could brew beer for free. That was the whole goal. But we realized we were onto something much bigger. And so we've currently commercialized 2 products, 1 product, 2 flavors, these granola bars. But like I said, our vision is much bigger. And that's actually a compostable film on there, which if we had more time, I'd love to talk about with this room because it's a big piece of what we're trying to do. And I know there's some contention about it. So what we're talking about here isn't entirely a new idea, and I'm just going to do kind of a rapid-fire quiz here of other things in the food system here. Anyone know what the byproduct from cheese is? Whey, very good. We eat that, right? You know, you don't really think about it like that, but it's already in the food system. It has been for a while. Yogurt, this one's similar. It's also whey, but it's acid whey. There's a company out in the East Coast. They make kind of artisanal yogurt called the White Mustache. They are taking their acid whey and they are upcycling it as a probiotic drink. I thought that was very creative. I love that. Juice. Pulp, very good. So the Forager Project, they're a company in San Francisco. Love what they're doing. They make very good, very expensive juice and other kinds of milks and things like that. But delicious stuff. But they have massive amounts of pulp, and they've actually created a line of chips from that pulp. And the sales of their chips are outpacing the sales of their juice. So they're like in this really interesting balancing act. They do some great framing though. It's called, they call them pressed vegetables in the chips. Pressed, it's all, this is, how do you kind of convey that your customers are making an impact on waste without yucking their yum? That's something that kind of my cohort of, something that our cohort of businesses, trying to solve this issue are really running up against. I've got a million of these examples. I know I don't have a ton of time. Coffee. I've been to Starbucks recently and seen their Cascara latte. That's made from the cherry of the coffee pulp. So no one really thinks of the fruit. This stuff rots in big piles at the country of origin. Chocolate has a similar byproduct. There's a company called Coffee Flour that's making a flour from this cherry, and it can be used in all sorts of culinary applications and provide also a source of income for the farmers, which is really interesting. So looking forward, this is in a lot of ways I believe what we're doing and what some of our other peer companies. I've got a bunch of other examples kind of below that we can talk about later. It's really a common sense business model. It's taking something that would be waste and it's upcycling it into a higher use. Waste to value has been a thing for a long time, and what we're here to talk about is kind of what would be waste into nutrition and closing nutrient loops. There are some challenges with it. So first of all, you can't just sell like the virtue of a product, and just gonna buy food because it's like an altruistic thing to do, that it's solving, waste. And so it's all about creating delicious products. That's been a really big focus for us. In the processing itself, keeping this stuff as a food grade ingredient is, has its own operational challenges for us. We've actually partnered with the USDA right up the road, actually in Albany, and they have a division dedicated to turning plant-based waste streams into novel sources of nutrition. So we're working with them on technology to scale a food-grade version of this process, which could potentially happen globally. When you're dealing with variable inputs, how do you get a consistent product, right? That's another challenge that we're up against. Marketing language is kind of what I was talking about earlier about, yucking people's yum and things like that. And then to be successful, we also have to have sales, right, and distribution. We have to operate like a food business. For us, I see a few phases of our company's growth. Right now we're in phase 1 where we're building a brand and kind of earning trust around rebranding what would be called spent grain, which I think is a pretty gross name for something that's actually really yummy, and creating a category of ReGrained products. And then from there we can start working with other mission-aligned food producers where we create ReGrained lines for them and kind of push it through their distribution channels. So there are some creative ways that this can be done, and there is precedent in other industries, but in a lot of ways it's kind of pioneering new ground. But it's super exciting because it's as an entrepreneur that just started, kind of stumbled on this idea because I loved making beer and maybe drinking it a little bit too, is that it's an opportunity it's a true opportunity, like in this, like for most of you in this room, to do well, to like have a business that is profitable, that is also solving a real problem. And so, we really are hoping to become an ecosystem service in cities everywhere for the changing, we need more plant-based sources of nutrition in our food system. We've got all this food waste, we've got people that are hungry, and eventually, we hope to help usher in this new model where we can do more with less, and that's really what we're here trying to do, and hope to be kind of a rallying force for the other companies that are trying to do the same and tell some of their stories. So that's all I have for you today. I'll kind of leave you with that question of what at the end of the supply chain was the beginning of a food revolution. I'd love to take some questions, and that's me on a tandem bicycle with my partner.
Right on time.
Yeah. All right.
So let's start over here.
What's the nutritional profile like of the grain once it's been spent?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's what's so exciting about this compared to like a pulp, which is basically fiber. So most beer is made from malt, some form of malt. Malt is just sprouted barley for the most part. So like all grains, it has protein. So it's actually about 20% protein. To put that in perspective, quinoa is like 14% 20% protein. Almonds are like around 20% protein. A cricket is like 60%. Yeah, people eat crickets now too. I don't know if you guys talked about that. That's about 60% protein. So it's a very viable source of protein. It's not a complete protein. We're still doing some testing on bioavailability and things like that, but that's one of the reasons why the USDA has partnered with us. I don't know how to pick.
Let's go with
Mr.
Mr.
Yeah.
Boone.
Mr. Boone. That is a good question. I couldn't fit enough in my backpack on my bicycle to get here today. I should do that, but we sell them online. We're launching in Berkeley Bowl actually. I think this month. And if you go on our website, there's a store locator. Send me an email. I'll send you a code, or if you can remember my last name, which is just Kurzrock. I know it's not an easy last name. You got a discount. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so we're using it's the NatureFlex NKR 120. It's a cello-based film derived from wood pulp, and it's got a barrier on it. It's a very thin film. I actually do have like one bar in my bag. If you find me, I can show it to you. And then we use water-based ink. So it's actually backyard compostable. This is not the standard with food companies for many reasons, one of which is that we're paying like 5 times or so as much as a conventional film would cost. We've got about half the shelf life. And even though this stuff, when it gets composted, a lot of times it gets pulled out of the stream anyways, even where municipal composting facilities exist. So it's definitely a situation where us trying to do the right thing is not the easy thing, and that's something that we hope to change. But for us, it's a non-negotiable, right? We're here to reduce waste as a business model, so packaging and planet-friendly packaging as possible is really important to us.
Roberta?
I too am a home brewer, so I applaud your effort. But the stuff we get is pretty coarse compared to the
Yeah.
whole grain. How much processing spent grain do you have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first step is actually stabilizing it, which we do through a dehydration process. If you eat our bars, they are pretty coarse, honestly. They're really fibrous. We're only able to use about 20% by volume of the grain in the bars themselves. What we're doing, though, is a next step of milling, and then we also can isolate the protein. And so as a flour, that's where it gets really exciting, because it's actually a really functional flour as well, which I'm happy to talk more about at a later time, but that's where we're heading.
Okay. Do you have any questions over here? One more? Okay.
Mr. Boone.
A couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to a guy from Pepsi,
Uh-huh.
and I told him the Mylar was my number one on my hate list. There's nobody anywhere recycles Mylar.
Uh-huh.
And he said to me, well, when we put sun chips in this biodegradable bag, the sales went down 16%.
Yeah.
Like, that was the only thing to say. And how would you talk to him?
Oh, well, yeah, people did hate that bag. That was really loud. We use a PLA. There's also PLA, which is like not super compostable in the first place, except for industrially. The future it's tough because we need this critical mass of brands. So if Pepsi were to come on board with saying compostable film is a non-negotiable value for us, the market would respond to it. We are baking it into our business model now from the beginning, which poses all kinds of challenges. We're at the minimum order quantities for pretty much all the films, so we're paying a lot for it. It doesn't perform where it should perform yet because there's not sufficient demand for it. So, I would encourage this executive from Pepsi to join something like OSC Squared, which is like one step closer. It's like a coalition of food companies here in the Bay Area that are trying to solve this issue and help us move the needle, because sustainability has to start, it has to come from both ends, basically. So I'd love to see them join that and make my film cheaper.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thank you.